Well, well, everyone, welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Sherpa. Today, we're featuring George Reavis, founder of MexEdge, and we will be discussing how foreign buyers can eliminate currency risk when buying or building property in Mexico. And that is a very important topic, especially in today's market, where we're dealing with a lot of pre-construction property and sellers that may be wanting to receive their funds in Mexican pesos. So, George, please give us a little bit of insight of why is currency risk such a big issue when buying property in Mexico?
Sure, thanks for having me first, Sid. I appreciate it. It's a big risk because let's say you're buying a 10 million peso home and the dollar to the peso is at 20 when you sign your purchase agreement. But then by the time you get to the closing table, which sometimes can take 3, 6 or more months, if the peso were to go to 18, that same 10 million peso house is now going to cost you $555,000. So currency fluctuations can just have a dramatic impact on what somebody ends up paying for a house in Mexico, or potentially a construction project. It can have a dramatic impact on the cost of that construction project.
Now, having said that, I want to reiterate to my viewers out there, in the Baja, specifically Baja Sur here, we're primarily dealing with a lot of expatriate sellers. So many of them want to receive their monies in US dollars. However, whenever they do find themselves wanting to deal with a Mexican developer, the opportunity may present itself to making the purchase in pesos or with an individual seller. So before we go into a little bit more detail on what is MexEdge and how MexEdge got started, would you recommend negotiating in pesos in scenarios like that?
You know, if you're buying something from a Mexican developer or Mexican national, we always recommend negotiating those contracts in pesos. Because typically, if, let's say something is priced at $1 million, if the Mexican seller wants a specific amount of pesos, the dollar price, they may bake in that sort of currency fluctuation risk in the dollar price. So they may say, okay, well, I want $1.1 million, but if you were to negotiate it in pesos, they may sort of remove that variable and you may get it for, $1 million at that day's exchange rate. So, a lot of times you can save money by negotiating in pesos with a Mexican seller or builder.
So where does MexEdge come in? How does it work? What is MexEdge?
So we come in and we lock in a guaranteed exchange rate at the start of the buy or build process, so that no matter what happens with the peso over the time it takes you to build your house or get to the closing table, once that exchange rate has been locked in, exactly how much that purchase or build is going to cost you.
So in that scenario, what other advantages? I mean, we know what we're going to get. We're going to lock in the rate with MexEdge. Are there any other advantages that MexEdge offers aside from locking in the exchange rate?
Well, yeah, 100%, because not only do we lock in the exchange rate, but the guaranteed rate is always increasing over time. So if you lock in, let's say the spot rate today is at 20, and you lock in that rate at 20, in a year, you're actually going to be getting a rate of, let's say, 21. So the rate always increases over time. And I don't want to get technical about that, but it's based on the forward points that are associated with the financial instrument that we use to lock in these exchange rates, which are called forward contracts. And those forward contracts with currencies come with forward points, or basically interest on those payments or contracts. And that's why the exchange rate is always increasing over time.
Okay, so let me see if I get this straight. So MexEdge ultimately will help my purchasers not only lock in a rate, but over time, let's say a year, these forward points, it's like a return on their money, so to speak. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And depending on the currency, you earn pretty much in between 4 and 6% on these payments or contracts. So once you lock in that rate at like I said, 20, in a year, depending on what currency you're exchanging, you're going to get it back at 4 to 6% higher because of those forward points. And the other great thing, me and you talked about this the other day, is that you're only, to lock in all of these payments, you're only putting down a deposit of 10%. So you put down a deposit of 10%. Let's say you're buying a $500,000 house. You will put down a deposit of $50,000 to lock in that payment in the future of $500,000. But you're earning the interest on the entire amount of the payment. You're earning the interest on the $500,000, not just on the 10% or $50,000 that you've put down to lock in the contract. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility, right? A lot of our clients, they are either using future earned income to pay for a property, and they don't have all the money when they maybe sign the deal on a preventa. Well, they don't have to have all the money. They can use that future earned income to help make those payments because they're only putting down a deposit of 10%.
Wow. Well, it sounds like there's only nothing but pluses here, George. I mean, there's got to be some downside to this.
Well, we think that there are only pluses. That's why we started the company. But, the only, I don't want to say negative because it's really not a negative, but the only potential negative would be once you lock in this rate, it's a contract, right? So you have to honor that contract. So if you have locked in a rate at 20 and then at the time you go to close, if the rate is at 21, we call that you're missing out on like an opportunity cost because you can't get out of the contract and then just say, okay, I want to take the better exchange rate available today. You're locked into the contract. But our clients don't care, for 3 reasons. A, once they lock in the rate, no matter what happens with the peso, they know exactly how much their house is going to cost in whatever their home currency. 2, they are getting some upside, right? It's not like they're just locking in at a flat rate. They're locking it in and they're getting between 4 and 6% of upside. And then the third reason is they're just protected against all of the downside. So they are getting upside and they're protected against all downside. If you're locked in at 20, the peso goes to 15 or 10, it doesn't matter. They're protected.
Wow. Okay, so again, this really does eliminate currency risk when buying or building property in Mexico. And in summary, so far, they only have to put down 10%. Okay. Did you cover this? They actually get a better rate up front compared to what they would get from a bank if they had purchased all the currency up front, right?
No, I don't think we talked about that, but yes, they do get a better rate. A lot of the transactions that we do, most of them are forward contracts or just payments in the future, but a lot of times we just do spot conversions, right? And a spot trade or spot conversion is just, you're not locking it in for the future, you're just exchanging money on that day. And whether you're doing a spot conversion or whether you're going into a forward contract on our banking partners platform, they're only paying a fee of 0.5% to do that conversion. So, typical banks are charging you, 2+%. So, because of the volume that we do with our banking partner and on the banking partners platform, we basically get like corporate level rates on these conversions. So it's a much cheaper way to move that money besides just, protecting yourself against all the risk. It's just cheaper in general.
Okay. Well, that kind of segues to what's in it for you as far as MexEdge. Where do you make your money?
Great question. We have an overall management fee of 1%. So, but we do a lot for that 1%. We give people access to these accounts and this product that they normally would never be able to have access to. B, we manage the whole process through we manage every payment, we manage setting up the account, we manage, all of the wires, helping the clients with, funding the accounts, helping the clients send the payments down to Mexico. That can be a lot of work. And it's especially a lot of work for the client if they don't have somebody like us to sort of help them, hold their hand through that whole process. So, we're there from the beginning till the end to make sure that all of those funds that are moving is just a smooth process. We hear all the time when clients are done using us, I might be on the phone for 10 or 20 hours with the client. And at the end, sometimes they're like, George, you guys should charge more. You do so much work to get all this done. So it's super worth it. So with us, it's 1%, but then on the platform, they're only charging you 0.5%. So it's a total of 1.5%, but that's still a 0.5% cheaper than if you're just doing a spot trade that has no protection with a typical bank.
And thank you for bringing that up again, because as you just said, one of the benefits is they don't have to give more than 10% of the total value of the operation up front initially, which allows them to keep that other 90% in whatever interest-bearing accounts they may have or wherever it is currently earning them some money. Plus, they're getting a better spot rate right from the beginning on the full amount of the transaction. And then on top of that, they're getting anywhere from 4 to 6% return on that. So again, if they're getting a 20-to-1 exchange rate, they'll end up with a 21-to-1 exchange rate when it's all said and done. So that loss of opportunity that you described earlier, I mean, as an example, if it had gone up to 25-to-1, I mean, there's always got to be a trade-off, George, right? Nothing's perfect.
Of course, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? But you're protected against all of the downside, and that's all our clients care about. And right now, currency markets are so unbelievably volatile, and nobody really knows what's going to happen with the dollar to the peso or the dollar to the Canadian dollar. So everybody just wants to protect themselves against this volatility.
So another icing on the cake, correct me if I'm wrong, is that these accounts are something that they can continue to use even after their initial transaction.
Exactly. We only charge 1% on the initial bulk transaction of the house build or the purchase. Then after that, the client has access to these accounts in perpetuity, and they can use them for just living expenses, monthly living expenses, whatever they want. I mean, think about it. If somebody's buying a $1 million house in Mexico, chances are they're moving, several $1,000s a month to live off of while they're in Mexico, and they can use the platform to do that as well. Not only to transfer the money, but they can also lock in each one of those monthly payments for the year so that, they're protecting themselves again against that fluctuation.
Wow. In today's climate where we've seen the dollar drop, as you mentioned earlier, in our meeting, a potential 10% difference that could really make a huge difference to someone in a scenario that we've been discussing. Share a little bit about your story, George. What is it that caused you to create MexEdge?
So, I've been a developer for over 25 years, and when I moved to Mexico 7 years ago, I'm a real estate junkie, and I continued to develop stuff down here. And I had a couple spec houses under construction a couple years ago, and we thought that our anticipated construction costs were going to be $1 million. Well, when we started the project, the peso was at 22, and we thought we were being conservative when we ran all of our numbers using 21. Well, the peso went from 22 down to 16.32. And it ended up costing me personally over $150,000 in just currency fluctuation. What we thought was going to be $1 million in construction ended up being $1.15 million. So that's sort of when I went deep into figuring out how to hedge or protect myself against these types of fluctuations for my personal needs. And once I had figured it out, I just had a lot of friends that would come to me and say, hey, George, I know you figured out how to hedge against this. I'm building 2 houses. Can you help me? Can you help protect me? And I started just working with some of my friends. And that's sort of when the light bulb went off. And I was like, man, this is a company. So we started MexEdge, and, we've been in operation for about 2 years. We've got, we've had a bunch of clients, done millions of dollars in transactions. And it's growing every day because the need is, so great out there, given this volatility and just what's going on in the world.
Phenomenal. Now, is there an advantage? Because obviously, U.S. citizens, U.S. residents are very much dealing only with one, if you would, currency factor difference, exchange from the U.S. dollar to the peso. What advantage is there with Canadians?
So with Canadians, there's sort of 2 advantages, right? If the Canadians are buying something in pesos, you remember how I talked about those forward points, and they're based on interest rate differentials between the 2 countries who are issuing the currencies. So if the US has an interest rate of 4.5 and Mexico has an interest rate of 8.5, the difference between those 2 is 4%, and that's what translates into the amount of forward points that you earn on these payments. However, with Canada, they have a lower interest rate. Canada's interest rate right now is at 2.75%. So the differential between Canada and Mexico is close to 6%. So going from Canadian dollars to Mexican pesos, you earn even more forward points or interest on those contracts. The other thing, the other thing is, a lot of Canadians are buying things in Mexico, but even if those things are not being sold in pesos, they're never being sold in Canadian dollars. If they're not being sold in pesos, they're being sold in US dollars. Recently, we've had a lot of Canadian clients coming to us not to hedge between the Canadian dollar and the peso, but to hedge between the Canadian dollar and the US dollar, because they're buying something in US dollars. And even that currency pairing is super volatile right now with all this tariff talk and whatever. So we'll come in and we'll hedge between the Canadian dollar and the US dollar to make sure that they know exactly how much it's going to cost in Canadian dollars if they're buying something in US dollars. And that's been kind of a recent thing, because the Canadian to US dollar pairing has, historically been relatively stable, right? But given the, current whatever geopolitical stuff going on in the world, it's just not. And that's what the Canadians are worried about, and we can also help with that.
Well, that's a great example, George. I mean, clearly it sounds like if this is a great service and product for US-based clients, then it really, really goes over the top for Canadians in that example, because it gives them the ability to either do it with pesos, should that be an opportunity, and of course also hedge with the US dollar, which is always a concern as well. Plus, between the difference in the rates that you mentioned a moment ago, there's a little extra added icing on the cake, so to speak, just to make things a little sweeter, right? So, and who can argue with that? All right, well, that's phenomenal.
With American clients, if they're not buying, if American clients are buying something in US dollars, we don't really serve a purpose. But for Canadian clients, we can work with every single Canadian who is buying something in Mexico, because they're either buying it in pesos or in US dollars, and we can work to help hedge them against either of those currencies.
So how does one get started? How does it work?
So we basically sort of have an introductory call with our clients. We've got a full presentation that we give to everybody that we meet with, prospective clients, and we go into detail, into sort of the nitty-gritty of really how all of this stuff works. We also put together sort of like a custom pro forma for, like a spreadsheet for each individual client and the specific deal that they're working on. So we'll put all the numbers into a spreadsheet so that we can show them exactly how much money they can save with us. We'll show them what happens if the peso were to strengthen 10% against the dollar or the Canadian dollar, how much more money they would save. And then we basically show them also how high the peso can go over that time frame before they would miss out on that opportunity cost that we talked about before. So we give a very thorough sort of in-depth presentation because we want our clients to understand exactly how all of this works. It's not, it is pretty simple, but there's a lot of terms and, just financial products people may not be familiar with. So we really take our time to explain all of that to make the process simple. And then after that introductory call, if they want to move forward, we start working through the process, setting up the accounts, and going from there.
So if someone, and of course you've already mentioned, I got to go back to it, the customer service is constantly ongoing. You're really there every step of the way. I believe you shared with me an experience where you're even there to remind them about what the deadlines, if you would, for payments or something like that, right? To make sure that everything gets done.
Of course, because if you're building a house, like if you're buying a house, there might be two payments, right? There might be one 10% down payment. There might be a 90% payment in 6 months. So a lot of times in 6 months, people forget everything. They forget how to wire money into the account or just how everything works. So we send them reminders every time they need to make a payment that just says, hey, don't forget you've got a 90% balance due on this date. This is the amount. Here's my Calendly link. If you need help scheduling this or moving the money, let me know. Book some time with us. And that's if you've got two payments. But some people who are building houses, they might have 20 different payments, and that's a lot to manage. So we're just standing by not only with the reminders, but for every payment to make sure everything goes smoothly. That's what we get paid for.
Well, that's a true benefit. One of the things that I tell my clients is that I am their real estate Sherpa, and I'm there to make sure that every step of the way they make a solid step every step of the way, right? Helping them make those decisions. And that's one of the things that I enjoy about working with you as well, George. I think we share that same ethic when it comes to providing service to our clients. So if someone's thinking about buying in Mexico, when should they reach out to you, and how do they reach out to you?
We always tell people the sooner the better, right? Because the sooner they hear what I have to say, whether they use us or not, they need to hear just me explain how all this stuff works so that when they are in the buying process, they're not thinking about currency fluctuation or thinking about the peso or thinking about this. They're focusing on buying their house, right? So the sooner we can get involved and educate them on the whole process, the better. We typically don't lock in any guaranteed rates until due diligence has been removed from a contract or they've signed their contract with their builder. We'll lock in the rate at that time, but we like being involved before that so that they have the knowledge that they need to make appropriate, wise decisions. We see people all the time who don't know about us, haven't heard just kind of my spiel on how all this stuff works, and they make bad decisions because they don't know.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Is there anything, I think we covered just about everything, George. Do you feel that we might have missed anything?
No, I was just going to ask you a question. When you sell a piece of property, and I know how good your customer service is, you're like us, how much time do you have to spend working with your client, dealing with banking details and international wires and holding their hand and the confusion associated with all that? It's a lot of work on your part.
Well, it is. There's that old adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's a lot of similarities between a real estate transaction in the United States or Canada as there is in Mexico. However, there's a lot of differences. And absolutely, one of the biggest challenges that I have is helping my clients understand those differences and why they happen, when they happen, timelines, et cetera, et cetera. Just like you, I'm there every step of the way they'll never get rid of me. so I'm with them forever, even afterwards. So in that respect, yes, whether they have to open up bank accounts in Mexico, even getting the residency as well for obvious reasons, to get their tax ID numbers, to get benefits when it comes to the sale of the property and reduction of a capital gains tax, et cetera, et cetera. We're with them every step of the way. Like I said, I'm their real estate Sherpa, making sure every step that they take is a solid one. Having said that, I would like everyone who's watching this today, if you have any questions, if you feel that we missed something, if you feel that something wasn't clear, please feel free to write your questions below. We'll make sure to answer those for you. Reach out to us. We've got our contact information in the description below as well. And don't hesitate. I mean, I will contact you within 24 hours or less if you reach out to me. So please, thank you so much, George, for your time today. Again, this is one of our first episodes of the Real Estate Sherpa, and I'm really proud and honored to do it with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sid. I appreciate that very much.
You have a wonderful day.
Ciao, guys.